Welcome back, friends, to another New World video. Today, we're going to be talking about tanking and the best tank builds for New World in Season 4. Now, between the Rise of the Angry Earth expansion and Season 4, not really that much has changed for tanking in New World. One of the biggest additions is we now have a new set of armor. Now, I'm actually being a bit of a cheeky boy here. I'm recording this on Season 3, so we're not actually playing on Season 4 right now. This is Baggins of the past. But in the Gypsum Kiln and from the new Glacial Tarn expedition, which should be in Great Cleave roundabout here, you can get this new set of armor called Frigid Dawn. So if you type it in Frigid like this, it should appear in the list, but we can also use New World Database to glimpse into the future and take a look at it here. So this is a full set of heavy armor, the helmet all the way down to the boots, and it has Magnify, which is a little bit of a bummer, but we can talk about how we can work around that in a bit, Enchanted Ward, and Elemental Aversion. And this is really good because usually getting these two perks is not something that can happen. It's usually you have Elemental Aversion or you have Enchanted Ward, but this has both of them. So you could have a full set of Health, Elemental Aversion, Enchanted Ward, or you could have Enchanted Ward, Elemental Aversion, Refreshing. I just think this is going to make you so tanky in both PvE and PvP situations that this is going to be some really good stuff and very desirable. Now, I also, while we were talking about the PvE and PvP, I do want to say that this video is going to be more catered toward PvE. This is going to be looking at tanking when you're jumping into a mutated expedition. So, for example, if we would go down to Barnacles and Black Powder here and then jump in on M3 and find a group that needs a tank, this is going to be a build that would be for that situation as opposed to like Outpost Rush or Wars. One other thing that's changing in Season 4 as well is gems. Both Moonstone and Jasper are getting some pretty significant buffs, and I think both of those have got some viability when it comes to tank builds and being placed in your weapons. But before we get any further into that, I think one thing that I want to do to sort of outline the intro of this video, now that we've talked about the Season 4 changes, is basically talk about the gold standard of tanking. What is the best tank build for Season 4? And it's actually the best tank build that we've had in Season 3, Season 2, Season 1. It's been the best tank build for a while now, and that is Sword and Shield Warhammer. Now, I'm going to cover this build first without any artifacts. So if you're somebody who hasn't been able to get any artifacts yet, if you're just coming back into New World or you haven't had any luck with getting them from mutated expeditions, we're going to cover, like I say, the non-artifact version. And then later on in the video, we're going to cover some artifacts that you can introduce, including like Flail as well, or Hatchet, the Wall, Tower Shield, Blood Drinker, Lost Stopwatch, and stuff like that. So if you're interested in some spicier tank builds or mixing it up a little bit, you can scrub along. But if you just want to see what is a good, solid tank build that will get you through pretty much any content, that's what we're going to cover here first. So let's just start off. Why are we rocking Sword and Shield? Why is Sword and Shield so good, Baggins? Why using it over Flail and stuff? It just turns out Sword and Shield has access to some incredibly good stuff. If we go into the Weapon Mastery skill tree, over here we have one of the best taunts in the game. It is an 8-second, 8-meter AoE taunt. It activates very quickly. It gives you damage reduction. It reduces the amount of stamina damage you take with blocking. It's just everything you want in a taunt. It can even then give you further extra damage reduction. I think it's up to a 50% damage reduction, which is absolutely bonkers. You've got an AoE damage buff here as well, giving everybody a 10% empower, just as long as you have the sword out, without any range limit on it as well. Access to really good rends here, movement, and then Shield Rush combined with the Fortifying Shield Rush just being one of the strongest fortifies in the game, with increases to armor, reductions from magical damage, and if you want to, you can go more tanky on the right side with defensive formation. Sword and Shield is just like, you know, it's the pinnacle of tanking. Amazon really hasn't made a better weapon for just straight up tanking yet. It is, you know, it feels like this is what it was designed for. You get a bit more aggression on the left side of the tree with the Swordmaster, but man, it is such a good tank build. Trying to play Flail, I have played it a few times, and Sword I do think is just a little bit better. It just ekes out as a better tank weapon. Moving over to the Warhammer, why are we choosing this over Great Axe or Spear or like any other sort of secondary? And that's because it has access to some incredibly good crowd control with CC. So we have Shockwave, which is like a classic stun. It also applies an AoE weaken as well. And then we have access to some incredibly good rend through Armor Breaker, which applies a 30% rend, which basically strips away or it makes the enemy have 30% less armor in a roundabout way. And then you can also apply rend with Sundering Clear Out. It's a perk you can apply to clear out, and you can also have Sundering Shockwave as well. Also, we get a lot of Fortify from here, 20% increase in armor from Power Cleaner. I've never realized that was the name of the perk there. 25% extra damage for 1 second after taking damage. I mean, it's just, Warhammer is just great, and honestly, you can kind of run multiple different combinations of abilities. It's just very disruptive, very good controlling weapon. and often ends up being like an S tier choice for most tank builds in both PvE and PvP. So for that reason, because Warhammer is the sort of perfect utility weapon, it's like a weapon that you can switch to, use ability and switch back, and then Sword and Shield is a great just main hand tanking weapon that just loves to be in hand all the time for cooldown reduction and for management of taunts and fortify and rend and movement and stuff. It really just is like a great weapon combination. But like I say, we're going to go over some other weapon combinations later on in the video if you're interested in some more like out of the box stuff. Now we're going to jump into the stats for this build. I am going to be assuming that you are running a full set of that Frigid Dawn stuff that we talked about. It's certainly what I'm going to be doing with my tank build, and as a result we are going to have lots of Magnify. Magnify makes it so that when you put a certain amount of points into a particular stat, it suddenly like swings one direction. So you can see my Constitution here is at 168. If we just keep going, we try and get to 200 con, it just suddenly boop, it flips over, because the amount of points that I have Magnify is probably like 100 right now, I would say, right? Let's see, we've got 32 Magnify here, plus another 31 Magnify, plus another 31 Magnify. So yeah, we've got about 90 Magnify. But if you're also using, if like all of your armor is the Frigid Dawn, then you could be like 30, 60, 90, 120, 150. So yeah, 150 points of Magnify. And it turns out one of the best ways to deal with Magnify is just to go for a split stat build. And I think it does actually work pretty well for a lot of tank builds. If you're trying to min-max, if you're trying to go for speed runs or, you know, sort of impress some M3 gamers or whatever, then maybe there is a better stat. But this is currently what I've been doing. 303 strength, 303 constitution. The con gives us the basic melee attacks getting grit, which means we'll be glowing white every time we attack, which means we can't really be interrupted. We don't really get bullied as much, so it's a lot easier to sort of manage the mobs. And then the 300 strength contributes to doing, you know, it's the only sort of scaling stat for the Warhammer right now. It is the main scaling stat. So it's 90% for the sword as well, and we also get base damage while under 90% health and all the other sort of benefits that we come along here as well. So makes you nice and tanky, but allows you to do a good amount of damage as well. And so that is the sort of stats that are going to be outlining the build here. I'm not saying it is the best stats, but factoring in the Frigid Dawn and how much Magnify and how much of a pain that is to work around, this is what I'm going to be recommending here for sort of a baseline tank build. Now let's jump into the weapon mastery. We already kind of glimpsed at it here as we were talking about the strengths of the Sword and Shield and the Warhammer. When it comes to the right side, I think Shield Rush and Defender's Resolve are abilities that you almost always want to slot as a tank. Defender's Resolve, as we covered, is one of the best taunts in the game. It is just something that's good to pop as you run around a corner and you get into a big pack of enemies, just going bump bump. And then getting everything to taunt to come towards you is going to be a great thing. One thing that you do want to be careful of with Defender's Resolve is, like, I see some tanks doing it, and I'm actually guilty of making the mistake, because I press the taunt button and then I immediately swap over. And whilst it's not, like, the worst crime to do, it does mean that you lose the 8-second buff, because as soon as you weapon swap, you lose the incoming base damage. So sometimes, you know, weapon swapping and then trying to stay with the sword a little bit more, I think is actually, you know, something that I'm trying to encourage myself to do as a tank player, and I would recommend for you as well. Other important pickups, like I say, Shield Rush in conjunction with the Fortifying Shield Rush, and we're not going to get into the perks on the gear, but this here is just so good. It can proc off of like hitting different enemies as well, so you can get multiple stacks of Fortifying Shield Rush. So like if you, it says max stacks here, but that means that, you know, you can't have it on your weapon and your shield as well, so you only need to have one of these. But it's just really good. If you Shield Rush into a pack of enemies, you give yourself a tremendous amount of Fortify, which increases your armor by a significant margin, and then it also applies an AoE weaken as well, so everybody that's within 5 meters gets a 20% weaken, so they do 20% less damage. It's a pretty big deal. You can even go down and get the slow as well. This is more for PvP. And then it's just taking a look at the left side tree here. I think the choice is between Whirling Blade or Leaping Strike. I've been leaning more towards Whirling Blade lately because it applies a 15% rend, which makes the target take more damage because it reduces their armor. And if you take the Tactical Strike and you pop this into a big pack of enemies, you can get a lot of cooldown reduction, so you can keep doing Whirling Blades over and over again to ramp up a lot of damage and make sure that the enemy stay focused on you, because one of the best ways you can have the enemies attack you, one of the main things about being a tank is, other than just staying alive, is making sure the enemies are focusing you instead of your teammates. And without taunts, the only other way you can do that is damage. So making sure that you output some damage, Whirling Blade sort of really kicks in for that. Speaking of damage, we also have the Leadership passive over here. There is a choice between going for Leadership or Defensive Formation. I think these are both honestly pretty excellent choices. I do see that a lot of players shame tank players for taking Defensive Formation. They're like, Oh, you're taking defensive formation? You're not a real tank. Real tanks play leadership. If you want to play defensive formation, go for it. I think it's a lot of fun. It does reduce everybody who's within range of your circle gets a 30% damage reduction. And this is an actual 30%. This is old school Fortify. Back in the day, Fortify used to mean that you just straight up take 30% less. If it was a 30% Fortify, it was just straight up you take 30% less damage. These days, a 30% Fortify increases your armor, which is nowhere near as good. But this is old school. This is just straight up like take less damage. And that makes it pretty good. And it can apply to your allies as well. So if you got a bunch of squishy melee players nearby, this does make you insanely tanky, but generally the favor is to go towards leadership because you're already pretty tanky with your 300 con and your full set of heavy armor and your tower shield and stuff, that going even further into the defensive side just ends up being a little bit overkill. And again, one of the mistakes that we said you can make as a tank player is just sitting like this too much with the block up and not attacking the enemy. You do want to make sure you're going in there with some left clicks, doing some whirling blades, doing some Warhammer abilities, and actually, in order to be able to maintain aggro. Because if you're just blocking, the enemy will eventually end up taking too much damage from your teammates, or the healer will heal too much and they will get the attention, they will get the aggro instead. So bearing that in mind, defensive formation, a little bit harder to make value out of because you ideally don't want to be blocking that much. You want to be blocking at the appropriate situation for big heavy attacks and stuff, or when you get low, but usually you want to be going aggressive, and that's why leadership is a little bit more popular. Also, a lot of speedrunners just like all that extra damage as well. Because we want to go leadership, we do have to take a lot of passives here on the left side. Which passives you go for, kind of your choice, but this is, what we're recommending over here. This one in particular I think is a big deal, Empowered Stab. Typically, most of the time you want to be going for a heavy attack to open and then use your abilities after that, because you get a 30% empower, which just, that's pretty big. Considering the empower cap is 50%, you can only be empowered by up to 50%. Any empowers after that go over the cap. You're getting a significant amount of way there. And actually, if I'm not mistaken, leadership is also empower as well. So you just get a 40%. You're almost getting fully empowered cap just with Empowered Stab and leadership. It's a pretty big deal. Passives that I like to pick up on the right side, other than the abilities, defensive training for the 20% fortify when we block. 20% is pretty big. Magical damage reduction, great for mutated expeditions. Physical damage increase, also still pretty good. Extra incoming healing is nice as well. Honestly, most of these passives over here are pretty good. The ones that I think you could maybe not go for: high grip, blocking a ranged attack, it's not super often. Invigorating bulwark, whilst it sounds good, we typically don't play with shield bash because we don't really need the extra taunt. Defender's resolve and then just hitting the enemy is often enough. Final blow for the extra threat could be good, but again, it's just the tricky thing is we have to put so many points over here to get the leadership passive that we're not really left with a lot to get what we want over here. So, whilst it would be great to take restoration and sturdy grip, and final blow, these are sort of the minimal, I feel like I need to take these passives over on the right side. Moving over to the Warhammer skill tree, there's a lot of good options over here as well. I think Shockwave is going to be a classic in the same way that we talked about with Sword and Shield, where Defender's Resolve is something you always want to take as a tank. I do believe that Shockwave is something that you'll always be taking as well. Clear Out can be sort of switched for Path of Destiny or Wrecking Ball or even Mighty Gavel, and the same with Armor Breaker as well. The reason why I've been going for these particular abilities is because we can stack a lot of rend. So you can see we've got Sundering Clear Out here, which says it inflicts rend, reducing target's armor by 25%. So I'm big into my rending sort of these days. We get another rend from the Whirling Blade, so 15% rend there. And then, like I say, with the Warhammer, 25% rend there, and then another 30% rend here. You can be getting close to the rend cap. And one thing to consider, I think the rend cap, if I'm not mistaken, is 70%. And you might say, oh, well, Baggins, you're already over that cap. There is a thing in Mutation Difficulty 3, and even in Mutation Difficulty 2, where all of the rends that you apply get squished down. They're only like 10% of their normal effectiveness. So like a 30% rend is a 3% rend. Now, citation needed. Those, I might be exaggerating those numbers a little bit, but either way, I think it is actually very, very hard to hit the rend cap in Mutation Difficulty 3, so bringing as much rend and weaken to the table as you can is actually a pretty good idea. So this is sort of like a rend tank. It allows your teammates to do so much more damage, and you can get through those boss fights so much faster, and that's kind of what we're going for here. So if you guys are in a sort of position where you would rather take, Wrecking Ball for a little bit more fortify and a bit more disruption, you can do that. But these have been my abilities of choice. So yeah, Armor Breaker for some rend, Shockwave for a good old bit of disruption. It's also got some weaken, and you can actually get Sundering Shockwave to make this do even more rend, and then Clear Out as well for the Sundering Clear Out. One thing that I used to sort of make the mistake of with Clear Out, I thought it was a terrible tank ability because it knocked enemies back, and it does, but when you're in a mutation difficulty 3, it just knocks them down rather than knocking them back, which is a lot less annoying, because knocking enemies back is disruptive to your melee players because you want to keep them all clumped up so you can burn them down together, but it does actually just knock them down in mutated dungeons for whatever reason. So yeah, it turns out to be a pretty good ability. And then outlining any other sort of passives over here, getting extra healing from crowd crushing ability seems pretty good. Applying a slow, not really that needed, but I guess it means that you know, it might trigger some other things like doing extra damage to slowed enemies. I think is something in the Sword and Shield skill tree. Doing extra damage when you take damage is pretty good. Cooldown reduction is always pretty nice. Grit with heavy attacks. Also, we get 12% damage reduction while Grit is active, and Grit is active like pretty much all the time. Because pretty much every Warhammer ability gives you Grit. You got Grit with this one here. Yeah, adds Grit to Armor Breaker. This ability has Grit. This ability has Grit. So you do get Grit with a lot of your abilities. So you just get a 12% damage reduction when you're attacking or when you're using your abilities, which is pretty good as well. I'm not going to cover every single passive here because it's just going to make the video unnecessarily long, but these are the Warhammer abilities of choice. But like I say, it is pretty flexible with what you take here. I think Shockwave is just going to be like a sort of baseline, and then Armor Breaker could be changed for something else. If you feel like you don't really want to go down the rending route and just need a bit more survivability or something, you could go for Wrecking Ball, Path of Destiny, or even Mighty Gavel. So let's jump into the next part of the video, and that is going to be our gear. So our armor, weapons, and jewelry, and then we're going to talk about gems as well. One thing that I do want to just get out of the way is Carnelian gems in your weapons are going to be baseline as a tank unless you're using specific artifacts or certain setups, which again we'll go into a little bit later on. Carnelian gems are mandatory. You can't really be a tank without putting these in your weapons because taunts are active, generate 300% more threat. Now, yes, I know Lost Stopwatch exists, but again, we'll go over that later on, but I do just want to really make that clear. For anybody who is like looking at this video as a first-time tank, these are like the #1 most important things you can do as a tank is make sure you have these in your weapons. If you don't have this socketed in your weapon, it becomes so much harder to tank unless you have one specific artifact in the game. Right, with that being said, let's go over the gear. And one thing that I kind of want to do before we even hover over this is again, recap that we do have that Frigid Dawn stuff that's coming in. So I could show you every piece of gear, but 24 to 48 hours from now, it is going to just be this stuff here. So Enchanted Ward, Elemental Aversion, and then the third perk I'm going to be putting on it is Health or Refreshing. So effectively, we could just skip over this part of the video. This is what I'm going to be rocking because I do believe it to be really, really good. But for the purpose, just in case maybe you don't have the Frigid Dawn set, you don't have the materia to make it or whatever, I'll just show you some like what we're currently running right now in Season 3. I tried to make sure that I'm at the refreshing cap, so 4 stacks of refreshing. Health I find to be very good as a tank. Enchanted Ward is also great. Elemental Aversion is also great, which is why, having both on my armor is something I'm very excited for. And then I'm using a bunch of this Azoth Crystal stuff. But yeah, gonna be updating all of this to the Frigid Dawn and then either slapping Refreshing or Health on it. One thing that I am missing in my setup right now is Sundering Shockwave. We talked about that, but that would be another way to add some extra rend. So getting the Sundering Shockwave perk here. So this Frigid Dawn would probably be like Refreshing, Enchanted Ward, Elemental Aversion, Refreshing, Enchanted Ward, Elemental Aversion, Health, Enchanted Ward, Elemental Aversion, Health, Enchanted Ward, Elemental Aversion, and then Sundering Shockwave, Enchanted Ward, Elemental Aversion, and then I pick up the extra Refreshing on my earring, and maybe even my amulet slot, or potentially the Tower Shield as well. Now moving down to the shield, this has been a pretty good piece of tech for me. So we have Void Shield Ward and Fortifying Shield Rush, and then we have another shield over here that is Nature Shield Ward and Fortifying Shield Rush, and then we would have Flame Shield Ward and Fortifying Shield Rush. So it's gonna take a little bit of a setup, and I don't think it's entirely necessary, but I do recommend it as a piece of tech because combining this Nature Shield Ward or this Void Shield Ward, for example, also with a Void Protection Amulet, there's 15% less void damage from here, then we have another 6% less void damage, and then we have another 15% less void damage. And it turns out that just by stacking the Void Shield Ward and then the Amulet together, you can actually get an incredible amount. We have 51.4% void damage resistance right now, and we only have 1 void gem on my gear, which is pretty bonkers. So yeah, basically at the void damage cap right now, and we just have the amulet and the shield, and then we're just using all opal gems. So by just switching my amulet and my shield, So for example, let's see if this is going to work here. So if we go find a different amulet, let's say that we wanted to do a nature mutation, because I think right now at time of recording we have mutated barnacles and black powder down here with a void mutation. But let's say that we wanted to go do the depths instead, and the depths, if I'm not mistaken, is a nature mutation. So we just want to switch over. What do we need to switch in our build to do a nature mutation? Well, it's actually pretty quick. We just do an amulet swap like so, and then we do the shield swap like so, and then what we should see is we have a lot of nature damage as option. Yeah, there we go. We're at 51.6. So rather than needing to change all the gems in my gear, all I have to do is change my shield and change my amulet, and that's it. And I just find that to be very manageable and very, you know, I don't know, it feels good. It feels good in my brain as a tank. So again, when it comes to the tower shield, fortifying shield rush, really, really good perk, something that you really want to have. And then the nature shield ward or void shield ward or flame shield ward, I think that's ideally what you want to be looking for there. Hated is also a good option. Sturdy is another good option, and even sturdy energy. But like I say, that fortifying shield rush and elemental shield ward, really good combo there for just making everything so much easier. Now moving over to the weapons for a classic tank build, you have a sword and shield obviously. So this is my one-handed sword. It's something I crafted. I locked in refreshing move, trenchant rend, third perk, shirking lightning, absolutely poopy. You don't really want to have shirking lightning on your weapon as a tank. I think most of the time shirking is pretty bad, but refreshing move is a must-have perk. If nothing else on your sword, I think you should have refreshing move. I just tried tanking an expedition earlier today without refreshing move, and the problem that I have is we take a look at this cooldown here. Look at that, 37 seconds, and that's with like max refreshing. But if you have refreshing move, every time you hit the enemy, it starts lowering the cooldown. You can actually really lower that cooldown very rapidly, and you know, I don't know how many seconds you can shave off of it, but I just want to say that it is a significant, you really, really, really notice that. So I can't downplay how important refreshing move is. It is just something that I think is vital to the tank build, and I encourage it above all else other than having that Carnelian gem. The next most important perk, I do actually really like having this Trenchant Rend here, which is why I locked it in. So Trenchant Rend says heavy melee attacks inflict rend. You guys may have guessed I'm a little bit rend obsessed with this build, but it just feels like it's a good aspect to lean down. It also sort of naturally leans in with the fact that we are doing a heavy attack roughly once every 5 seconds with the Empowered Stab anyway. So the Empowered Stab gives us the 30% empower when we hit the enemy. It also rends them to make them, you know, take more damage because they're rended, and then we can go in with the Whirling Blade or Shield Rush or whatever else we want to do. So yeah, the Trenchant Rend just feels like it's a great sort of second perk to have on the sword. And then the third perk here, I would go for either Thwarting Strikes or Leeching or Enchanted or Vicious or Keenly Jagged. I think any of those would be good. Ideally, I'm looking these days, I think I'm going to be going towards Leeching, or we would go for Thwarting Strikes. I have been trying to farm for the Tei sword for a little while now. As you can see, I got pretty much every Tei weapon. So Tei Greatsword, Tei Ice Gauntlet, Fire Staff, Void Gauntlet. I couldn't get the Longsword to drop, and the Longsword has Refreshing Move and Trenchant Rend, so we can just take it to the Gypsum Kiln and upgrade it and get that third perk of choice. But sadly, could not get it to drop, so maybe going to try a little bit later on, but that's probably what I'm going to be looking for. If you guys do want to farm the Tei Longsword for yourself as a tank, it's really easy to do. You just go up to Skysong Crypt. There's an enemy you can kill in the cathedral. He's called Ivan. There's a guy with a what would you call it, a coffin on his back, and then there's like a witch lady over here. You can just do a cycle between these three. They respawn really quickly. They're super easy to solo, and fingers crossed you get luckier than me, because like I say, I've had pretty much every Tei piece of gear under the sun other than the sword, which is then great to take the Gypsum Kiln and upgrade. Moving over to the Warhammer, as I've already explained, I'm a bit sort of rend obsessed, so might not be as necessary for you, but Sundering Clear Out or Sundering Shockwave as a second option, that would be the first thing I'd prioritize on the Warhammer. After that, I think Thwarting Strikes. It says 7% damage while you have grit. Pretty much every Warhammer ability has grit, so just 7% damage for all of your abilities and most of your attacks as well. And then I think Life Stealing, or again, you could go for that Trenchant Rend or Enchanted or Vicious. But yeah, this is sort of, I'm really happy with this Warhammer combo here. But like I said, I would prioritize having the Thwarting Strikes and an ability of your choice, Sundering Clear Out or Sundering Shockwave. And then the third perk could be Life Stealing, Hated, Vicious, Keenly Jagged, etc. Lastly, let's move down to the jewelry. My amulet right now is health, nature protection, stamina recovery. So having health and protection, we've already covered this with the tower shield, but it's a little trick that you can do there. It means you can get pretty lazy with your gems because we can just go with a health and void protection amulet, like this one here, health and void protection. And then I talked about, we can switch over the shield as well for void shield ward, and it just means you can be pretty cheeky. So the third perk here actually doesn't do anything because it's a medium equip load. But, the health and protection perk, the most important thing there. Decent sort of perks that you can get in the third slot would be Divine. So Divine for incoming healing is going to help your healer out quite a lot. And then also on this nature amulet that I just had over here, this was stamina recovery, which is also pretty excellent as well. Because, if you ever get in a dicey situation where you run out of stamina for blocking or dodging, this can come in and save you. I also think Fortified and Empowered are pretty good for tank options as well. So, yeah, Fortified, Empowered, Divine, stamina recovery, any combination of those. If you had to sort of choose an ideal, I think Divine, you can't really go wrong with that. It is pretty solid as a tank. You are going to be standing in sacred ground, hopefully most of the time, but I do really like the stamina recovery, and I've heard a lot of tanks do like either Fortified or Empowered as well. Moving on to the ring, if you're going down the full Magnify option at the Frigid Dawn, then I really do recommend making the Azoth Crystal ring. So you can make this one at the Gypsum Kiln. It's pretty straightforward to do. So if we just go here and then we type in Azoth Crystal, it's going to show us a bunch of pieces of gear. But as you sort of finish your season pass, you'll get a lot of this material, which you can then go ahead and make the ring. It has Hearty and Leeching locked in, which is pretty good. And then hopefully you're going to be seeing the third perk of Slash Damage or Strike Damage. Also, Keen would not be a bad option as well. So Hearty, Leeching, Keen, Awareness, Hearty, Leeching, Slash Damage. Those are going to be the ideal outcomes that you're looking for. The ring that I have here is Hearty, Leeching, and Slash Damage because we are going to be spending most of the time sort of doing attacks with the sword and then switching over to the Warhammer to drop a stun and then switching back to the sword again. So Slash Damage gives us the most value there, and Leeching just gives us a little bit extra lifesteal as well. Lastly, on the earring slot, my ideal earring would be Despised, Regenerating, and Refreshing. I actually think Refreshing Toast is pretty kind of poopy these days. 10% cooldown often saves you like 2 seconds on a potion, which really isn't that big. So just instead taking a Refreshing off of the armor, freeing up a slot on your armor so you can have a weapon perk, or you can have, that health elemental aversion enchanted ward that we've just been talking about, and instead just chucking Refreshing on your earring. However, Despised feels like it is a must-have for a tank. Of all the sort of earring perks, a lot of them are quite underwhelming. Despised, it is a pretty big game changer for the tank for extra threat generation, and then Regenerating is actually another way to generate threat as well, because you are constantly healing yourself through Regenerating, which does allegedly also trigger aggro, and I think it would be modified by the threat generation from Despised. So Despised and Regenerating just feel like a match made in heaven for that sort of tank aggro generation. Last thing to talk about with tank builds is your Heartrune choice. I opt to go for the Stalwart Heartrune of Stone form. It gives you some healing when you activate it. It gives you Fortify when you activate it. It's a pretty weak Fortify. It's mainly just the healing aspect, and then it gives you Stagger and Crowd Control immunity as well, so you can't really be CC'd, you can't be knocked down or stunned. But if you want to go for a bit more of an aggressive option, I think the Grasping Vines for an AoE Rend and an AoE Weaken is pretty good. If it's a nature mutation, Bile Bomb can be pretty good for healing reduction. And if you want to be a bit of an edgelord, then I think something like the Dark Ascent Heartrune, you go up in the air, you slam back down, it gives you a lot of healing. It's actually pretty good as well. So there's quite a few viable options for the tank, but my sort of base recommendation for just safe tanking is the Stalwart Heartrune of Stone form. Now, when it comes to artifacts for tanks, there are quite a few options. I think one of the best or sort of most solid, there's really no downside to it in terms of artifacts that you can slap into your tank build, is the Void Darkplate. This says your armor is increased by 20%. Now, there has a little bit of some people get confused by this. There was a rumor going around that it was bugged and it was only increasing the armor of the chest itself, but it does increase your overall armor by 20%. It just doesn't factor in other benefits that you get from Constitution, but still a flat 20% increase in armor, and it has health, enchanted ward, physical aversion, not really that good compared to elemental aversion, but it's still a solid piece of tanking armor, and I think it is like just an easy sort of fit in for any tank build. So just slapping the Void Darkplate on often will make your tank build just stronger. This comes from doing mutated Barnacles and Black Powder, so you do have to wait until it's a Barnacles and Black Powder mutation. It can be difficulty 1, 2, or 3, so if you're just looking for an easy time, jumping in M1 and hoping to get the Void Darkplate to drop from the final boss. One good thing about Season 4 is they are increasing the artifact drop rate from 10% to 20%, so doubling the drop rate of it. So this is the #1 sort of tanking artifact that I recommend you go for first if Mutated Barnacles is available. Pretty easy pickup. The next tanking artifact I'm going to recommend, and it is one sort of near and dear to my heart, and that is the Wall. Now, this is a bit of a weird one, because unlike the Void Darkplate, it does have some downsides to it as well. So this one says you take 25% less damage from all elemental sources. So you take 25% less damage from Void, from Frost, from Nature, from Fire. It really turns you into quite a tank, and a lot of boss fights, they do add in an extra elemental component to them as well. So the Glacial Tarn, which is probably going to be live when this video comes out, there's a lot of frost damage in there, but it might be a fire or void mutation, so you've got the problem that it's also frost and void at the same time. If you go into Barnacles right now, which we currently have, the final boss, Nereid, she does lightning damage, nature damage, but then you also have void damage on the floor as well. If you go into the depths, you've got the nature mutation and taking nature damage from Fiendish, but then you also have Captain Thorpe doing fire damage. You have the first boss doing void damage. So you've got all these different elements, but the Wall says, don't worry, bro, I got you covered, because it just reduces the damage from all of them. You also have 33% more stamina as well, so we have a lot of stamina to play around with here. 143 stamina when we combine it with Hearty. It's pretty awesome, but the downsides of the Wall is that you cannot dodge. So if I try and press the dodge button here, we straight up can't dodge. And also, it has Keenly Fortified as well. It says gain 10% Fortify for 3 seconds on critical hit with a 10-second cooldown. In my opinion, this perk just straight up sucks. It is a real stinky perk. It's a shame that they locked that on there. You can't change it. But that being said, the 25% less damage from elemental sources, you've got to get good and pressed in that block button at the right time, but I think it's a lot of fun to play with. It's my favorite tank artifact, and this one comes from doing Mutated Ennead, so you have to do the Ennead Mutated at difficulty 1, 2, or 3, 20% drop chance from the final boss. When it comes to perk upgrades, by the way, I didn't actually cover it, but I would slap Fortifying Shield Rush on here, and I would slap health on the Void Darkplate. So health on the Void Darkplate, Fortifying Shield Rush on the Wall, but I do think these are a lot of fun to play with. Void Darkplate is probably better overall because there's no real downside to it, but I would, I would recommend trying to tank with the Wall. I do think it's a lot of fun, and it kind of means that you can sort of forget everything else as well. It's sort of that same concept where I talked about if you have Void Shield Ward, and then you have the Void Protection Amulet, you can kind of just run, you could go with a different amulet instead. We could go with Ankh, which is another tanking artifact that I could recommend as well. This says incoming heals are 25% stronger. It is getting a little bit nerfed in Season 4, but still, being able to get 25% more healing from the leeching on your ring. Actually, no, they nerfed that. That doesn't work anymore, but 25% more healing from your healer will help them keep you alive. I believe it does also apply to the healing that you get from the Heartrune, the Stoneform Heartrune as well, so yeah, just kind of keeping you in the fight longer. The only downside is that the final perk here, you could put Flame Protection on if it's a fire mutation, but then what if it's a frost mutation the next week? What if it's a nature mutation? So locking in a protection perk is a little bit risky because it only works for one particular mutation, of which there's like 4 different types right now. So stamina recovery is the option that I went for there. But I do think this is a decent tanking option as well. Also in the amulet slot, we have the Lost Stopwatch. This one's pretty interesting here. So the Lost Stopwatch says, activate taunt gems and you generate 300% more threat. Stuns last 1 second longer, but base damage is decreased by 10%. Now this is a spicy amulet because it allows you to forego having carnelian gems in your weapons, and I think a pretty good, interesting piece of tech in the next expansion is going to be to put a Moonstone in your sword and shield instead, because Moonstone says you do 20% more damage if all of your abilities are on cooldown. And it's actually pretty easy to put your abilities on cooldown because you go in, you do the taunt, you do the heavy attack for the Empowered Stab, Whirling Blade, Shield Rush, and now your abilities are on cooldown for quite a bit. And, so you're going to be just doing 20% more damage now, and more damage equals more aggro. And like I say, you don't need to worry about having the Carnelian Gem. You'll still get the taunt because that's what Lost Stopwatch does. So if you want to do a bit more damage, or run some sort of spicier builds, then the Lost Stopwatch is also a pretty solid tanking artifact as well. Allows you to get away with some more unconventional tanking builds, run different gems in your weapons, try tanking with a weapon that doesn't even have a gem in it, like the Spark of Mjolnir, which we're about to cover. If you want to get the Lost Stopwatch, this drops from Mutated the Depths. It comes from the final boss. You have to kill Captain Thorpe in the Depths. And again, it's from difficulty 1, 2, or 3, 20% drop chance from the final boss. The final jewelry artifact that I want to cover is Blood Drinker. I think this one's probably a little bit worse than Lost Stopwatch and Ankh, but it gives you 20% 25% lifesteal. So if you're having a hard time, like if your healer just doesn't seem to keep you alive, then you could go for Blood Drinker, because it basically all of your damage you just heal. So you can see though the damage reduction is pretty extreme here. We're, you know, hitting for 1874, 1968, 1874. Whereas previously, if we just go back and switch over to the other ring we were just using, you can see the damage numbers, it's not huge, but it is a difference, and it is going to mean you generate less aggro. But one thing that I am not definitively sure on, but I think it works this way, is lifesteal does have a threat component to it. So if you're lifestealing and you're healing yourself, that is generating threat, which will then sort of make up for the fact that you're doing less damage, which is less threat, but you're lifestealing, which will generate more threat. So yeah, if you want to be a bit more of a solo independent tank who doesn't need no healer, then Blood Drinker can be great for that, but I do think it is a lesser choice for tanks. That being said, you can get it from Mutated Starstone Barrows, which is in Everfall, from difficulty 1, 2, or 3, final boss, 20% drop chance. Lastly, when it comes to tank weapons, we have the Butcher in place of a one-handed sword. So the Butcher, I think I have in a build down here right now. The downside of the Butcher is it doesn't have refreshing move, so you can obviously take it to the Gypsum Kiln and put refreshing move in it, but when it comes to the Butcher, it doesn't have a gem slot either. So you have the Whirling Blades, the Empowering Whirling Blade, Keenly Jagged, and then it says take it to the Gypsum Kiln to upgrade it for the final perk, and you can choose what the final perk is. You can choose for that to be a gem slot with the gem setting pins. So if those of you who don't know, if you go to your faction vendor, it's on the third page down. There is a craft mod you can buy called Gem Setting Pins, and that will allow you to put a gem in the Butcher and a few other artifacts. But then if you go for the Gem Setting Pins, you can't have Refreshing Move, and as we covered earlier on in the video, Refreshing Move is very, 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 very important. So sadly, because the Butcher, it's gem slot or Refreshing Move, and I think you typically do want to put a gem slot in a weapon, because whether it's giving it extra damage or the Carnelian Gem, it just makes it a little bit trickier. So the only way that I could see the workaround here is you put Refreshing Move in the Butcher, and then you put Lost Stopwatch on, which will then count as the Butcher having a Carnelian Gem anyway. But that's a bit of a workaround. And then if you're going for Lost Stopwatch, you probably then need to go for the Wall, because if you have Lost Stopwatch, it has the same problem that Ankh has, where do you put Flame Protection on it, or Frost Protection, or Void Protection, but then it's not going to be good in the other mutations. You don't want to be changing the perk all the time, so hopefully you guys can see where I'm coming from. Just kind of a bit awkward to work around with the Butcher. I did initially have version 1 of this video where we were using the Butcher, but I just decided it's a bit too tricky. So whilst the Butcher kind of sounds fun, I actually don't think it's really that good for tanking, because, you know, again, it's lacking that refreshing move. You got to choose between that and the gem slot. The other weapon that we could go for is the Spark of Mjolnir. Some of you guys might be wondering, like, oh, I mean, again, I said I was going to show this build without artifacts, but this is your artifact Warhammer. Would I take this over a normal Warhammer? Again, it has the problem that it doesn't have a gem slot, which is a little bit problematic. And you can't actually put a gem slot in this, because it converts its normal strike damage to lightning damage instead. So we just go ahead and slap this on here. You can see that every hit that we do with the Warhammer is a lightning damage over here. But this actually ends up being kind of bad for us, because strength usually cares about physical damage. So we lose this benefit here. This 10% physical damage doesn't apply to the Warhammer because it's doing all lightning damage. It also locks you into certain perks as well. It's got Mighty Gavel on it. And it also has Mighty Gavel causes a weaken. So if you do want to play a Gavel build with the Warhammer, it's good. But I think Gavel is maybe a little bit worse than having the Sundering Clear Out. I just value that a little bit more. Sundering Shockwave or Sundering Clear Out as opposed to Refreshing Mighty Gavel. I just don't rate it that highly, and also it does lightning damage and it doesn't have a gem slot. So again, it's a bit more of an awkward build around, and I think you're kind of just better off, like I say, taking the Warhammer that I've got here is something that I think I'd prefer to slap into the build. So finally though, the other artifact that I want to talk about here, and I'm aware this video is going pretty long right now, so I wanted to talk about Flail, but we might have to do that in a separate video. But one artifact that I do think has like some serious sort of upside when it comes to tanking is the Artifact Hatchet. This is Freya's Francisca. So this says, thrown axe projectiles reduce all axe skill cooldowns by 25%. It's got a 5-second cooldown, but this effectively allows you to infinitely taunt the enemy. Now, to really make this work, you are going to need a piece of gear as well that has Refreshing Torrent on it. So I've got these boots here. It says, each attack of Raging Torrent reduces all hatchet cooldowns by 5.3%. So what you can do is you can pop taunt with Berserk. Berserk, like Defender's Resolve, is actually a really, really good taunt because it's an 8-second 8-meter AoE. So you can see in the sort of secondary text down there, the sort of grayed out text. If you have a Carnelian gem equipped on your hatchet, activating this ability inflicts taunt to 8 seconds to all enemies within 8 meters. So 8-second taunt. The downside of this, though, is the cooldown doesn't actually kick in until you weapon swap. And then after that, it's a 15-second sort of cooldown. So usually you're going into this problem where, you know, Berserk is a good taunt. But after, you know, you're waiting for the cooldown basically for a long time. But this is where the Flail Francisca comes in like really, really amazing, because you can basically go taunt on all the enemies, weapon swap back, do the cooldown with the thrown weapon, do the cooldown with the refreshing torrent, and would you know it, your taunt's basically ready to go again, and it's not even been 8 seconds. I mean, I think we can try and sort of time this down here, but it is basically just a synergy of getting the big cooldown, so we get 25% cooldown reduction when we land a thrown projectile with the axe, which just so happens to be our rending throw, and then refreshing torrent basically does the rest of the work. So we'll time this one out here. We have 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and there we go, and we're back again. 7, 6, 5, 4 taunt. So you can basically go infinite with your taunts. If you're having struggle holding the attention of enemies, if you just, for whatever reason, if you just like to play 500 constitution and you do like no damage at all, but you want to make sure the enemies are always attacking you, this is the tech to go for. So it's Flail Francisca. The final perk that you put down here doesn't really matter too much. I went for Attunement, but if I could change this, I'd probably go for Vicious. But yeah, it's basically a combination again. You do have to have Refreshing Torrent, and then you sort of taunt, weapon swap back, range throw, Refreshing Torrent, and just the cooldown is like almost there, ready to go again. So it does require a little bit of a sort of a rotation of abilities, but it can be very powerful. Right, I think this video is going really long at this point, but I do also want to slap in sort of the flail here. So we do have Odo as a artifact tank option. It says on block, heal for 5% base health. Base health is actually not really that exciting. I think that the base HP of a character in New World is somewhere between 6,000 to 7,000 HP, so 5% of 6,000 is really not a lot of healing, and it's on a 3-second cooldown. So it turns out that like Odo isn't really that good. It's got Refreshing Move and Lifestealing. Refreshing Move, again, just like with the sword, is really important because you want to be sort of activating taunts back to back over and over again. But outside of that, Odo doesn't really have too much going for it. But there is one final piece of tech that I wanted to show you. It's not on Odo, but it is available with a sort of flail, and it's getting this Crowded Bludgeon perk on the flail here. So it says if 2 or more enemies are hit with Warded Bludgeon, even if the hits are blocked, to reduce its cooldown by 25%. I don't know if it's a bug or something going on with this perk, but you can effectively have infinite taunts with this as well. So I'm going to go ahead, put this on, and then find a big pack of enemies and show you what's happening here as well. So I found myself a nice big pack of enemies here in the Brimstone Sands, and what I'm going to do is imagine we're just in a dungeon right now, so we'll pop the Tonto Pronto with the Defiant Resolve, and then just get them all sort of grouped up. Typically you want to be pulling to the archers, that's like usually the play here, and then we switch over to the flail, and we hit them with the bludgeon, and then with the bludgeon, and then with the bludgeon. You can see the ability is basically going infinite, but it's doing damage, and the taunt component is going out as well. It's pretty disgusting. I don't know if like this is something that is like working as intended. It might be something that sort of gets nerfed after this sort of video goes out. It does require that you do have to sort of make direct contact with the ability. I think it's on like 4 to 5 enemies, but all I can assume is that the 25% component of it is like stacking up. So if you hit, I guess it would be 4 enemies. 4 times 24 would be 100%. So if we can hit 4 enemies or more, the taunt effectively does go infinite. So let's see if we can get it here. Almost the infinite cooldown. There we go. We got it there. And again, nearly. Yeah, so very, very powerful. I think it is definitely something to consider when it comes to flail tanking if you want access to near infinite taunts. Bludgeon does have a bunch of other like awesome components in its skill tree as well. So we can, you know, take a look at that once we just get these enemies to stop attacking us. Drop down here. If we go in, we take a look at the skill tree, and this is typically what it'd be running as a flail tank if you did want to go for the flail tank. It does provide a 50% increase in armor, so increasing armor by 50% for 8 seconds. We're still getting rudely attacked by this Sphinx. We have to deal with this guy real quick. Also, this ability here as well, the Smite, gives you lifesteal, which can be pretty good if you want to stack it up with the Blood Drinker, and then you've got some pretty excellent movement with the Barrage. It is a little bit awkward to pop it when you're on a boss, because it will pull you forward just a little bit. But I do think there is some merit to playing with a Flail and Shield and Sword and Shield using the wall, because you can block with both of these weapons. So if you wanted to go for something, like I say, a little bit unconventional, you wanted to step away from the crowd control and rend and stuff of the Warhammer, and instead just rock for like 2 weapons that can benefit from the shield, Flail and Shield, Sword and Shield has been pretty fun, largely because of that crowded bludgeon sort of shenanigans there, but Reinforced Fortify, 50% damage reduction, or 50% Fortify. It also does this sort of thing where it links you to a teammate as well, gives them Empower. You both gain damage absorption. You've got the Human Shield over here to absorb damage from a teammate, so, and then again, the weaken that it applies with the Lifesteal. There's some pretty good stuff going on for the Flail. I just think that the Warhammer is a little bit better, or sort of complements the sword a bit better as well. But playing the wall with a sword and shield and a flail and shield, I do think is also a pretty fun combo. And like I say, you can do that sort of infinite crowded bludgeon wombo combo as well, provided you can put crowded bludgeon onto your flail. But that is something, again, that you can't do with Odo, because Odo, you have to make the choice between a gem slot or having crowded bludgeon. You can't have both. All right, we have gone like at length in this video, far longer than I wanted to go for. I think the only other sort of important things that I could say when it comes to tanking is, like I say, make sure you're not spending the whole time blocking. When it comes to a big pull like we did before, you want to be pulling the melee enemies over to the ranged enemies and then fighting on top of the ranged enemies. Be careful when it comes to overlapping your taunts, unless you do have, you know, the infinite taunt shenanigans of Hatchet or with the crowded bludgeon. You do need to sort of try and space out your taunts to be a little bit more effective. Make sure you are attacking, you know, you're dealing damage is also part of tanking as well. And remember to use your consumables. Honing stones will help you deal more damage. Coatings for the particular enemy you're going into. Glacial Tarn is probably going to be around the time this video is, and I think it's either ancient or human enemies in there. So human coatings, human ward potions, ancient ward potions for damage reduction. Stat food, typically you'll be looking for banana bread or banana parfait for the constitution or strength, depending on what you need more in your build. But yeah, that has been I would say a quick look at tanking, but it feels like this has also been a very long video as well. I tried to cover quite a lot of different aspects, but mainly just show off the Sword and Shield Warhammer build at the same time. If there's any other aspects of tanking that you guys want to discuss, let me know in the comments down below, or hop into the stream. We are going to be streaming a lot of New World over the coming weeks with the release of Season 4, with the new artifacts and all that good stuff. So yeah, if you guys find this video useful, make sure you go ahead and click the like button, subscribe if you want to see more New World deep dives and different builds in the game, and as always, I'll see you guys all in the next video.